Aboriginal Australians are the indigenous peoples of the Australian mainland and the island of Tasmania. They have a rich cultural heritage and deep spiritual connection to their land. They feel integrated with the land, and it is critically important to their culture and identity. Historically, they depended on natural resources for their survival and livelihoods. They continue to maintain strong values of land stewardship. Rivers and water systems are critical to all aspects of Aboriginal culture, and they are also considered a part of the land. The Aboriginals occupied their land for more than 60,000 years before European colonization. They were hunters and gatherers and consumed only what the land could naturally provide them. Land management is historically integral to the Aboriginal people's culture, environment, and livelihoods. They cared for the land through traditional practices such as controlled burning to protect the land. Thus, they had little effect on ecosystem composition and function. British Captain James Cook and his crew discovered the Aboriginals of Australia in 1770. Aboriginals were seen as inferior because of their charred dark skin, strong facial features, unintelligible language, and unfamiliar lifestyles. They were classified as subhumans, barbarians, creatures unworthy of proliferation, and subject to extinction. The colonists used a term called terra nullius, which, based on a British concept of ownership and industrialization, allowed them to conclude that the territory did not belong to anyone. The colonization of Australia and displacement of Aboriginals by the British is a case of environmental racism or deliberate targeting of tribal communities. In taking their land, the colonists took the path of least resistance to exploit marginalized indigenous groups that lacked the power to resist. Distributive injustice, an unjust allocation of resources, occurred as the British forcibly took control of and degraded the Aboriginals' natural resources. The Aboriginals were excluded from planning the continent's future as the colonists began to industrialize and pollute their land, displace and sometimes kill the indigenous populations. As in many formerly colonial countries, indigenous populations remain the most marginalized groups. Environmental racism persists in contemporary social structures. What is the responsibility of the Australian government in restoring land rights to the Aboriginals? For centuries, injustice continued until the Australian people joined with the Aboriginals to say no and begin a process of reparation through various demonstrations and referendums. Finally, in 1993, the High Court of Australia overthrew the concept of terra nullius and began to recognize the native title to land and waters. These court decisions enabled the Aboriginals to make claims to land based on Aboriginal traditions and customs instead of British common law. European colonists arrived to Australia more than 200 years ago. Their treatment of the land, especially through agriculture and forestry, produced rapid ecosystem change. Since European settlement, 50% of Australia's rainforests have been cleared, and there has been a shift from diverse, deep-rooted perennial species to non-native, shallow-rooted agricultural species, and subsequent changes in soil and hydrology. Water pollution, impoundment, erosion, and degradation of riparian ecosystems cause serious concerns for Aboriginal societies. The colonists introduced many non-native plant and animal species to the continent, which disrupted the ecosystem, causing regional extinctions and interfering with the Aboriginals' livelihoods. In mineral-rich Australia, large companies mine iron, nickel, aluminum, copper, gold, uranium, diamond, coal, petroleum, and natural gas, among other minerals and elements. Mining or resource extraction, as well as industrial development, pose serious threats to indigenous cultures due to related health issues, environmental degradation of natural resources and culturally and religiously important lands, and loss of livelihood. These problems persist today, clearly making this a case of environmental injustice. Introduced species include plants and animals for agriculture, aesthetics, companionship, and consequential of commerce. Water buffalo impact water quality and river morphology, and thus the water supply for both drinking and agriculture. Omnivorous feral pigs relentlessly alter ecosystems, prey on native species, and destroy croplands. Consequently, Aboriginal communities are unable to successfully raise crops that are important to their culture and health because the crops are eaten by feral pigs. Despite increased land rights, the Aboriginals' perspectives continue to be discounted, and they are still largely excluded from land management in Australia. They lack procedural rights, meaning they are unable to participate and are not represented in legislation and decision-making. For example, while Aboriginals suffer the burdens of European water use and pollution, their indigenous knowledge is not taken into account in river management. They are often unable to access remote areas to practice controlled burning, and non-Aboriginals do not understand the cultural significance of fire management. Aboriginal knowledge is thus decreasing among younger generations. Thus, the government seems to have reinstated rights to the Aboriginals, but justice has yet to be restored. In the 20 years since the native title was recognized, the Australian government has made some progress with involving the Aboriginals in land management practices. A successful example of this is the Feral Camel Project. In this project, the Australian government is currently devoting resources and cooperating with Aboriginal people to incorporate Indigenous knowledge and perspectives in the management of non-native camels. Projects like this help improve Aboriginal well-being by promoting cross-cultural understanding, participation, and sustainability. Well-being is the people's ability to sustain their land, language, and culture. Studies on Aboriginal groups have found a connection between sustainability and mobility. Specifically, the ability to live in the community of one's choice plays a role in the reported satisfaction and happiness of Aboriginals. Recently, there has been an increase in Aboriginal mobility as well as their ability to maintain their land. These improvements helped establish Aboriginals' stronger sense of self as well as self-determination. Although the Australian government has made strides of progress towards justice, they have not done enough. Many Australian scholars published reports and made recommendations for the Australian government to modify its laws and policies and to closely consult Aboriginals during this reframing process. Yet the Australian government did not follow up or make the recommended changes. Further studies revealed Aboriginals still do not feel reconciled to non-Aboriginals. Even though Aboriginals seem to have more mobility and relatively more rights to land, this has not dramatically affected the sense of reconciliation with non-Aboriginals. In order to achieve reconciliation, the Aboriginals need not only land rights, but also participation in land management. In addition to granting Aboriginals rights to their natural resources, the government should consider Aboriginals' perspectives and values. The Australian government must preserve Aboriginal ecological knowledge and actively involve Aboriginals in land research and management. In order to effectively restore the environment as well as Indigenous cultures, Australian land management must incorporate Indigenous values, beliefs, knowledge, and needs. For management of the country's natural resources to be sustainable, the government must cooperate with Aboriginals and allow them to participate in land management. This should occur through management practices including invasive species control, fire management, river and catchment management, and other conservation methods such as research and education. Government funding and resources should promote and facilitate traditional Aboriginal practices on their land. In the case of mining, Aboriginals have rights to govern their land and negotiate with mining companies. However, they still lack bargaining power in agreements with large mining companies, allowing them to be exploited. The Australian government must cooperate with the Aboriginals and enact legislation to protect their rights, their land, and their communities from large corporations. They may also require compensation and reclamation to alleviate the injustices and burdens of mining. Additionally, the government could provide further compensation for the environmental and cultural degradation caused by displacement, deforestation, invasive species introductions, and industry. Despite recognizing the Aboriginals' land rights, the Australian government has yet to restore justice. In order to achieve reconciliation, the government must cooperate with the Aboriginals in land management and protect Aboriginals' environmental and human rights.